to a new edition of Hora del Instituto Universitario de Investigación Ortega-Gasset Gregorio-Marañón. I'm pleased to inform you that the last two conferences of this year are going to be about cultural heritage. Today, we are going to discuss a very interesting topic that we have entitled Athens Antiques, their management and integration to the modern city. And for that, we have today with us the great expert, Professor Tasos Tanoulas. Thank you very much for having you here. Architect Tanoulas was born in Thessalonica, Greece in 1947. Since 1977, he has been member of the restoration team of the Athens Acrópolis. And since 1984, he has been in charge of the conservation of the Propileos building, which is the monumental entrance to the magnificent complex of temples that crown the Acrópolis, as everybody knows, the most sacred place of the ancient Athens. For all his work and dedication, he received the prize Europa Nostra in 2013 and a lot of prizes and awards. He is author of several publications with international impact, and he has been guest speaker in multiple focus. In addition to this, a particularly happy day for the world of archaeology, as a result of the awarding of the Princess Asturias Award of Social Science to Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, a great Tenochtitlan archaeologist who has dedicated his life to the excavation of the major temple in Mexico City. So we are very happy today with this conference in these circumstances. At last, I want to thank to Carmen Serrano de Haro for making possible that Professor Tanoulas is here today with us. Carmen will be our guest speaker next week with a lecture entitled Cultural Heritage and the Current Remains. And he's going to lead our conversation after your exposition in the next minutes. Professor Tanoulas, you have the floor. We are eager to listen to you.
Thank you for your generous introduction, and I'm very happy to be here and among my friends. And of course, it's a great honor. And also, it is a great. Well, is that? Do you hear me? Yes. Is that all right? Yes. I'm very happy to be here. It's an honor to be here among in this institution, of course, and among friends, who the presence of which I appreciate so much. I would like also to thank the Hispania Nostra Association and the Ortega-Marañón Foundation for arranging my visit to Spain and this lecture. Throughout the long history, something happened. Oh, here. Okay. Throughout the long history of Athens, because of their size and sturdy construction, the classical monuments functioned as nuclei to which new construction works were added for their adaptation to new uses. The monuments of the Acropolis, for example, were externally obscured and internally divided by new walls in order to serve the Parthenon as a Christian church and later as a mosque, the Erechtheion as a church and later as the Latin bishop's residence, the Propileos as part of the Acropolis fortifications and as the Latin Dukes of Athens defended house with a chapel. The modern Greek state, established in 1830, incorporated the ancient Greek identity in accordance to the contemporary global spirit of Romantic classicism. This was followed by a systematic effort to promote the monuments of antiquity. Following practices applied in the cities of Western Europe since the Renaissance, ancient monuments were first stripped of their medieval and Turkish additions and then exhibited in the middle of wide spaces which allowed viewing the monument from a distance. For their display in the center of public open spaces, the town plan of Athens anticipated extensive compulsory purchases to facilitate the excavation and development of antiquities in organized, safe, and publicly accessible archaeological sites. Main road access were aligned with the monuments and the archaeological sites, deliberately creating a relationship of coexistence and dialogue. The Acropolis, by royal decree of 1833, ceased to be a fortress and became a center for archaeological activity. Later building phases were removed, and since they were considered insignificant, they were not documented prior to their demolition, and whatever survived was by pure chance. The fortified character of the rock disappeared, and the classical ruins received occasional works of stabilization and restoration. The clear aim was to recover the classical Acropolis, as you see there. And you see here the Acropolis above the Acropolis in the end of the Middle Ages. Then during halfway in the Ottoman occupation, you see it is 1687, and at the bottom is the Acropolis in the middle of the 20th century, an archaeological site. The major excavations of the Acropolis in between 1885 and 1890 removed practically all the backfill and every single later construction phase, leaving only the classical ruins. These were followed by restorations, which were carried out at the Parthenon in two periods, between 1898 and 1902, and 1922-1933, in the Erechtheion between 1902-1909, and in the Propileos, which you see here, between 1907 and 1917. Also, there was a restoration of the Athena Nike between 1935 and 1940. These systematic excavations and restorations at the Acropolis took place during a particularly difficult period of economic crises and wars. In line with the great idea and irredentist concept that expressed the goal of reviving the Byzantine Empire. There is a historical parallel in antiquity of the Periclean building program on the Acropolis of the 5th century before Christ. Only the Parthenon, part of the Propileos, were actually built during the lifetime of Pericles, in times of peace, that is. It was only during the Peloponnesian Wars, which lasted from 432 to 404 before Christ, that the Propileos was completed. The temple of Athena Nike, the Erechtheion, and a large part of the northern fortification walls were constructed completely, from the beginning to the end. At the end of the military dictatorship in 1974, and during the whole of the subsequent period of discussions on the country's accession to the European community, the Acropolis found itself once more at the center of international interest. All this chimed symbolically with the return to democracy, the establishment of the Committee for the Preservation of the Acropolis monuments followed as it was expected in the next year, 1975. The issue this time was the urgent need to deal with the problems that had arisen from the advanced oxidization of the metal reinforcement used in the early restorations. The symbolic correlation with the recent restoration of democracy is evident in the discussions of whether, and if so, how, contributions proposed by UNESCO could be accepted within the frame of reference that works on the Acropolis should remain exclusively under Greek jurisdiction. The appeal for the return of the Parthenon sculptures removed by Lord Gelgin in the first decade in the 19th century during the Ottoman occupation, and now in the British Museum, was reintroduced. The issue was given great publicity, mainly because of the promotion of this topic by the international movie star Melina Mercouri. Although more than 3 decades have elapsed since then, it continues to linger like a smoke screen between the awkwardness of the Greek state in managing its cultural heritage and public opinion. Meanwhile, progress on restoration works at the Acropolis became stalled for at least 2 decades in bureaucracy. Matters were drastically shaken up by the Olympic Games in 2004. The Games brought the Acropolis into the center of attention again, as it advertised the Greek origin of the Olympic Games on television throughout the world. From 2000 and 2004, the restoration works received an unprecedented boost. And despite the post-Olympic downturn in governmental interest, this momentum was maintained until the completion of the approved programs in 2010. This time round, 75% of the cost of the works was covered by European grants. As a result, the view expressed 3 decades earlier that the intervention at the Acropolis was a matter exclusively for the Greeks, proved to be unrealistic. And then 2010 saw the so-called economic crisis and the extreme humiliation of Greece and the antiquities. Throughout this long period of time, the way in which restorations were carried out changed very much. This is the previous image. In the 19th century, the first monument to be restored was the Temple of Athena Nike. The intervention was directed by a team of competent archaeologists and architects and was archaeologically correct. Later restorations by Pitakis, an autodidact Greek archaeologist, could be classified as empirical, with no standards of scientific method and documentation. During the 50 years before the Second World War, in which Nikolaos Balanos monopolized the works at the Acropolis, his technique changed without ever acquiring the scientific methodology required. Correct identification and management of the original material for the correct restoration of the form and dimensions of the architectural fragments was not properly done. Readily available building materials like cement and iron were not tested in laboratories to guarantee that they can be safely incorporated in the monument. The result was destructive effect because the oxidization and expansion of the densely distributed iron caused extensive breakages in the restored parts of the monuments. These effects imposed the last restoration project of the Acropolis monuments, which started in 1975, as mentioned before. Balanos was succeeded on the Acropolis by Anastasios Orlandos, an architect and archaeologist who until then was responsible for restorations all over Greece, excepting the Acropolis. He was very strong politically. After the Second World War, at the end of the Greek Civil War in the 1940s, the first attempt on the Acropolis undertaken by Orlandos was the restoration of the parts of the south wing at the Propileos, which had been removed by the Franks and recovered from the demolition of a 15th century construction attributed to the Florentine lords of the Acropolis until 1458, when they had to surrender the Acropolis to the Turks. Two were the main improvements contributed by Orlandos in comparison with Balanos' method. The original blocks were restored more or less to the right places, and stainless steel was used for the reinforcement of the architrave instead of commercial iron. But still, Orlandos did not hesitate to mutilate ancient materials in order to obtain stronger joints, while no care was taken in restoring the original dimensions and form of the restored blocks and of the major architectural parts of the building. This is before Orlando's restoration, and this is after Orlando's restoration. This restoration project remained incomplete until 2013, when it was restored after a new thorough study of the material. It was completed in 2016. The extensive damage of the built environment in European countries during the Second World War promoted the debate on restoration issues and management of monuments on an international level. The debate culminated in the Charter of Venice, which was signed in 1964 and contains a set of theoretical and practical principles which are still of great value and influence as they correspond to humanist ideals which persist to the present day. At the same time, in Greece, the first case responding to this new frame of mind was the restoration of the sanctuary of Artemis at Vravrona in the east coast of Attica. The restoration methodology adopted by the interdisciplinary committee for the preservation of the Acropolis monuments since 1975 was similar to that applied to the sanctuary at Vravrona here. Since each individual monument must be treated as a special case, I will focus on the restoration of the Propileos, which I was responsible for. Even in the case of the Acropolis, where all the buildings share the same structural elements, each building differs as to the details of the design, the craftsmanship of the masons of antiquity, and the structural history. To this, the restoration carried out since the 19th century must be included, because in this long period of time, the technology and the concept of restoration changed considerably. Another important factor is the people involved in the new restoration project, as they have to interpret the existing parts of the building and a complex system of data about the monument in order to bring it to a new life, in the same way that the conductor and the members of the orchestra must bring to life a musical piece. The architectural parts to be restored were assembled from fragments which belong to each other, that is originating from the same member, and, where necessary, incorporating new marble, which was from the Mount Penteli, which is similar to the marble the ancients constructed the Acropolis monuments with. At all stages, the work was, where it was incorporated, supplementary pieces in new Pentelic marble was used, known to have been used at the Acropolis in the 5th century. So we see here how they copied the casts. These casts are in gypsum, and they are copied in new marble. In the same methodology used in ancient world, Greek and Roman times. At all stages, work was documented in detail with descriptions, measurements, drawings, and photographs. The new marble supplements were adapted to the profiles of the original materials with appropriate carving of the new material, never of the ancient material. Ancient iron clamps and dowels were replaced with horizontal double T connectors and vertical pegs in titanium. Instead of using lead that was proper for covering the iron joints in the original construction up there, cement was used because when titanium and lead come together, they lose their properties. They exchange ions. Titanium was also used for the fabrication of the remaining metal connecting elements. So here you see that the ancient technology deliberately tried to have the iron broken in the middle in case of earthquake. Here, we tried to reproduce this kind of technology by making the clump weaker in the middle, because the clump is thinner in the middle and the cement is interrupted. So we hope that in the future we'll have the same effect if something happens. You see that it worked very well. Oh. The organization of the worksite of the Propileos was a very demanding project. This was due to the location of the Propileos at the west edge of the Acropolis plateau, to the vulnerable classical remains which surround the Propileos. And last but not least, to the fact that it provides the only way in and out the Acropolis plateau. This is the only entrance and way out of the Acropolis. The area was cleared and duly studied and published. The floor was made of wooden planks. The floor was made of wooden planks paved on a massive iron structure resting not on the built remains, but to the living rock of the Acropolis. Measures were taken for the protection of the rock, which is a monument on its own right. Dismantling started in 1990. Sorry. This is after the dismantling of all the blocks that had to be dismantled. And you see that the east front of the Propileos is lowered to this level. And the next day, we started rebuilding, restoring the buildings to their original places. This was May 2003. Great concern was given to the exact reproduction of the details of the classical forms carved in new marble. This was achieved by means of accurate measurements and templates. During the procedure, it was realized once more that Balanos's restoration was only approximately conforming to the original architecture. Most challenging was the reconstruction of two Ionic capitals which were carved by hand, restoring the original forms according to existing fragments. Their making took on an average the work of two very skilled workmen for 27 months. Thanks to the technical ingenuity of our marble technicians, the original design has been rendered with technical and artistic integrity worthy of that of the ancient originals. I usually say that they are the clones of the ancient originals. And so you see that we have used templates to reproduce all things according to the original design. And here, these are some stages from carving the pulvinus, the bolsters of the Ionic capital. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we have templates which were shaped on the ancient, on the original fragments of the capitals, and then they were used on the modern construction. And this is a detail of the finished capital, and this is the finished one of the finished capitals. These capitals were restored on top of the easternmost columns of each of the Ionic colonnades, framing the central passageway before the monumental central door over there. The restoration of the superstructure of the central building was completed in December 2009. The picture above is after the finishing of the south wing in 2016. And below you can see the restored parts of the ceilings, which were restored, were extended above the central passageway, and so all the visitors have to go under these parts of which are roofed now. Before they were not roofed. In the restoration of the Propileum, the following principles were applied with religious reverence. The structural characteristics of the original classical structure were meticulously reproduced. The main bonding element in such structures being gravity through friction between the abutting surfaces of rectangular blocks, each block was restored to its original dimensions and shape, thus securing sound contact with the neighboring blocks. Sockets for the accommodation of titanium clamps and dowels were duly carved, as we saw before. New marble was added sparingly, so this is from the future. New marble was added sparingly when it was necessary for the acquisition of the above qualities. As in antiquity, no mortar used, and if gaps were to be filled, they were filled with lead. Through the study and documentation of the original material, we achieved the restoration of the form and dimensions of Mnesiklis's edifice, with both regards to individual architectural members as well as to the restored superstructure as a whole. This was not done in the previous restorations. Through the study and documentation of the original material, we achieved the restoration of the form and dimension of Mnesiklis's edifice, both with regards, I read this. The whole enterprise has involved the disassembly, conservation, and reassembly of 301 blocks, and the incorporation in the structure of another 66 blocks. These latter blocks have been restored for the first time in the superstructure of the building above the central passageway, which we see here, thus allowing the visitor to get a feeling of the proportions in the two roofed spaces of the main building of the Propileum. In the end, there have been put up 367 architectural members, the weight of which varies from half a ton to 11 tons. From the above, it becomes evident that during the last 2 centuries, the monuments of antiquity, above all the Acropolis, played a huge role in the political and ideological history of the country. They were always attributed a high level of ideological significance, and the interventions were aimed at the recovery of not only the physical body, but also of the cultural and moral values it represented. Since 1980s, however, the idea of managing antiquities to increase their readability by non-specialists, that is, tourists, has gained traction in the context of cultural values. This idea has grown over the last 3 decades, and as a result, the fate of the ancient monuments has been completely overshadowed by their economic potential. Early examples of this are the interventions at the Asclepieion of Epidaurus, initiated in the late 80s, where new materials, natural and artificial, have been used to such an extent that the percentage of the authentic material is quite small. In cases like these, it is hard to define the result within the established terminology. What was described before at the Acropolis and Vravrona is defined as restoration or anastylosis. The term reconstruction in the context of Greek stone architecture means the return of the ruin to its original form, with the application of not only original material, but also a considerable amount of new material. Most known example is the Stoa of Attalus in the Athenian Agora. In these cases, it is mandatory condition that all structural and architectural details are reproduced correctly after an exhaustive study of the surviving evidence. This does not hold for the monuments in some cases of interventions since the late 1980s. In these monuments, sections have been restored about which not enough evidence exists. So some parts we don't know if they are correctly restored or not. I believe that this type of management is symptomatic of the postmodern concept, and that new terminology is needed for buildings created in this mode. I suggest we define them as post-monuments. And an example of a post-monument is the trophy of the Battle of Marathon. This so-called restoration is in fact a new construction in new marble, the position and form of which only partially correspond to the original. The priority given to the use of the monument as a tourist attraction and not to its cultural value for national identity, archaeological information, and aesthetic and moral concepts is obvious. Even at the Acropolis, the pressure for an even greater extent of restorations with new marble is constantly increasing. In addition, the burgeoning tourist industry of recent years and the resultant need to move large numbers of visitors within limited space and time scales has led to proposals for interventions in archaeological sites whose realization would be damaging to the ancient ruins and would create misleading impressions. An egregious example is the new works done or planned for the Acropolis, which show a dramatic change in the theoretical and ideological concept of dealing with the classical architectural heritage in Greece. From the end of October to the beginning of December 2020, on the Acropolis Plateau, very extensive areas and paths were paved with reinforced concrete. The pavement covered over much of the face of the living rock, which is a monument of its own, according to UNESCO. A huge outcry rose in Greece and later across Europe and America. These implementations circumvented entirely not only the Greek legal frameworks, institutional standards, but the international ones as well. Beyond the aesthetic damage caused on the site, they are responsible for the following permanent damages. The pavements are practically irreversible due to the use of a metal mesh very close to the living rock. This is the metal mesh, you see. This means that in the future, any effort to remove it will certainly cause damage to the rock. The inappropriate use of electrical mechanical equipment has caused abrasions and cracks on the living rock. You see here this caterpillar percussion drill, which shouldn't exist on the Acropolis. It's illegal to be there. Blocks of an in situ ancient ashlar masonry were cut back to make room for the metal reinforcement of the foundation of two metal posts related to the construction and function of the massive elevator abutting the northern Acropolis wall. The whole thing will be impossible to be removed without causing serious damages to the neighboring monuments. Despite all these negative effects and criticism, the use of reinforced concrete is a daily practice on the Acropolis for constructions for the drainage system, which started being constructed retroactively after all the pavement was done and we had already many floods on the Acropolis. And also it is used on the outside. You see, this is at the south, along the south side of the Peripatos, and this is the installation for the elevator and the water pipe leading the waters outside the Acropolis. More new projects have been announced to take place in the near future on the Acropolis. They consist of the addition of new materials across the whole of the Acropolis plateau and the construction of retaining walls to hold back earthworks. This leveling will bury the rock and vestiges of the ancient buildings between the major monuments and will irrevocably erase the historic unity and continuity of the Acropolis, freezing it in a theoretical form for which there is not sufficient evidence. Recently, priority was given to the reformation of the Acropolis west slope in front of the west facade of the Propileos. The west slope was cleared in the 19th century from the later structures. You see a photograph dated 1869. This is a photograph of the 1980s. You see that some original Roman steps were recovered after the demolition of the medieval construction, and still they are surviving here. And later, this path here was constructed for the facility of the tourists, and this is something very discreet and reproducing an access which was used before the Propileos in the late classical and Hellenistic times. For the restoration of the Roman steps will be needed the use of lots of new materials, you see. The restoration of these Roman steps will create a stepped piazza starting from the lower end of the west slope of the Acropolis there, and will cover at least the 3/4 of the area. The most of the situ archaeological remains will be covered. As it will reach the Propileos, and then and will allow access to the tourists through all the width of the Propileos. Now the people are entering through the central passageway, which was, as it was done in classical antiquity. Now they will go through the building, and this will cause many problems because additional structure will be needed in the building to protect the steps and the floor, and also the safety of the visitors. These interventions would impose a new reconstruction, and really it would be really irreversible. I mean, you cannot remove such constructions without causing damages to the classical material, the body of the Acropolis. In the conference in November, which was held especially for discussions of these problems on the Acropolis, in November 2021, the reformation of the west axis of the Acropolis seemed to involve the larger area around the Acropolis, to the south, to the end, and to the north. And so in this slide, you see the yellow shadow shows all this involvement. And what is indicated here with the yellow shadow is what will change according to the new proposals. But the proposals are very vague. There is no real proposal. It is only ideals and plans and things to discuss. These plans are aiming to serve a major project of transforming the historic center of Athens into a tourist-oriented agglomeration, providing quick and easy access to the archaeological sites, museums, shopping center, and urban tourist attractions. That is an ideal place for short visits favored by cruises, which offer very little to the local economy because they usually are prepaid abroad. Thank you. This was...
Thank you so much, Professor Tanoulas. It was an amazing exposition, and we all enjoying about your exposition. And I think we are worrying with the description that you made us with the last 2 decades and the decisions, political decisions made about the situation of the Acropolis. I would like to remark your definition about post-monuments and how to include this kind of vision in the actual thought, no? And I think it's really relevant to rethought what is happening through the vision of archaeologists. So thank you so much for your exposition. And now Carmen Serrano is going to lead our conversation, and if any one of you want to do any question or whatever, for a few minutes with Professor Tanoulas. Thank you so much. There is a microphone.
Thank you. Professor Tanoulas, thank you very much for your lecture. I'm interested on the political side of the restoration. I understand that you've been the top responsible of the restoration of the Propileos for many years from a purely technical point of view. But I've heard you saying that on top of you, above you, you had the Ministry of Ancient Monuments, or whatever it is called, and probably further on, you probably had also international organizations like ICOMOS, keeping a close eye on what you did from a technical point of view. Can you comment a little bit to what extent the politicians have affected your technical decisions? And I'm thinking about not only about budgetary issues, but also about using new materials, restricting accessibility of the public visitors during construction works, limiting the total amount of visitors allowed in the area. Can you comment a little bit how these 20 years that you've been responsible from the technical side of it, the politicians have affected your work?
The politicians, I have to be keep close to that. Look, I belong to an older generation. The things that are being done now are being done by another generation of politicians and, architects and archaeologists. So, there was a Ministry of, there is a Ministry of Culture in Greece, in which responsibility the antiquities are. But the pressure has gradually towards over restoring and also towards the excessive exploitation for tourism is growing little by little, gradually in the last 3 or 4 decades. But it is very recently that it was expressed so violently. Really, the Epidaurus example, which I showed here, it is the late 80s. So it was, it caused many discussions. In the end, the people who were responsible in the committee taking the decisions were people influential, archaeologists and architects working for these things. They are, in a way, colleagues. And they had some political influence also. And they could do this project, but this was just that. Little by little, this example was expanded, and we have some new restoration which applies the same principles. Too much restoration with not complete documentation. Let's say in a little island, which is the Episcopio, something like that, which is near Antiparos. There is a restoration with 90% new material. And not all the archaeologists agree with interpretation of the team which is responsible for this. So this is something which is done under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture. And this is in the last 15 years. Before that, the policy was different. The pressure was not so much. What happens now in the Acropolis is a violent explosion in the last 2 years. So it was something unexpected. And when this, also the lockdown was used for that, because people were not visiting the Acropolis, And it was, the works took place in obscurity, and it was through some people working up there that I learned about this. And it is only after the opening of the Acropolis in March 2020, let's say, that the public could see what had happened, and the outcry became much larger, and also journalists from all over the world could visit, and we had the outcry spread all over Europe and America, I mean the United States.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. You referred to Melina Mercouri and her campaign for the return of the Elgin. You referred in your exposition to Melina Mercouri,
yes,
the actress and former Minister of Culture in Greece, and to her particular campaign for the return of the Elgin marbles to Athens. 30 years, as you have said, have elapsed since the campaign was launched, and there has not been a positive response from the British authorities. My question is, if at the end of the day the British government were to change its position and decide to send back the marbles to Athens, in your personal opinion, should they be exposed in the new Acropolis Museum or integrated in the whole restoration of the proper sites in the Parthenon?
Well, this cannot be done anymore, because even some parts of the sculptural decoration of the Parthenon existed on the building. They have been removed in the last 15 years. The last metopes, which were fairly well preserved, have been down to the museum. Also, all the west part of the Ionic frieze around the cellar of the Parthenon have been removed. They are in the museum. So if they go to the museum, they will have to be to Athens. They will have to be in the museum. Anyway, at the moment they are restoring the lateral walls of the Parthenon with 85–90% new marble. And I don't know how far, there are some plans. So they will not reach the top of it. Ideally, which I would like to hope, but I don't hope really. I would like to hope that it will never be completed to restore all the walls of the Parthenon up to the top of them with new marble, because there is some marble, but there is very little and very damaged. So they have to add a lot of marble. And sometimes what they do, and is very silly, there is a substantial piece of wall block, let's say, from the wall. And they are missing, but the surfaces on both sides are missing. And they make a sandwich. They close the ancient material in new marble. So what is visible from the outside is new marble. So why do they do that? I cannot understand. Because what we did at the Propileos, when we had to put a substantial fragment, let's say, in the restoration, we added as much marble, as much new marble as it was necessary for the stability of the building. But we allowed the ancient material to be visible, because that's why we restored this part of the building. We have the material, but it is not stable enough, let's say, if we use just the ancient piece. So we add new marble, and we make it good to be reconstructed. In the Parthenon, they close it like that. So I don't know why they do it. Anyway, it is a restoration which aesthetically I don't think is good. Also technically, they do not use this handmade technology. This is something of the last years. I mean, until the 2010 at least, and later for a few years. I mean, the job was done by hand. We are using always machine, but the last work on the surface of the marble is done by hand because we need to be sure that in the future the surface of the marble will deteriorate in the same way the ancient surface deteriorated, because all these machines, by using very fast speeds, let's say, and whatever technology, water technology, to lower the temperature during the cutting, let's say, we are not sure that the surface will behave in the future as the ancient surface, which was handmade. So until 2010, the final surface, the final 2 millimeters were removed by hand always. This is not done anymore. So what you see is something which is cut by a machine. And this is really very poor, the impression. So there is no way of going back to the Parthenon, the parts which are in the British Museum, because they were taken when the building was there. Yes, so this is a great pity. But in the New Acropolis Museum, there are the exhibition in the New Acropolis Museum of the Parthenon marbles is so that they are arranged all around the shape of the original frieze. The dimensions is of the original frieze. And there are some, the blocks which are in the British Museum, they are represented there with copies. I mean, moldings, casts. They will be removed if they will, the Elgin marbles will come to Athens. There is a problem, though, that in order to enter from the central escalade, let's say, to the exhibition with the Parthenon marbles, there is a gap. The door is through a gap where the blocks of the frieze are missing. The problem will be, if in the future somebody finds these blocks which are missing, there will not be any door to enter. A new door must be opened somewhere else. This is difficult, but anyway, this is a kind of joke, because we have to hope that these slabs will never be found. The Acropolis, I'm critical of the Acropolis New Museum because the way it is designed, really, it is was not everything was not thought. I mean, I think this is mainly the how to say, the responsibility is to be applied to the Greek authorities, because they didn't demand very clearly from the architects the spaces that were needed for the exhibits, particularly the architectural exhibits, because we have architectural exhibits there, and they have certain dimensions. You cannot change the dimension of the building.
I think, let me say to you that I think all of us, we are very confused.
Sorry?
We are very confused on that. How is it possible that whoever is working in the Acropolis without permission, in obscurity, as you say, how is that possible that nobody knows if the Parthenon is going to be completed or not? I mean, we imagine that all works in the Acropolis must be submit to permissions, international committees, heritage, UNESCO.
Yeah. Yes.
It's, no?
Yes, but it's not done.
It's done.
I cannot give you an answer. I'm not.
Give me an answer. No?
I cannot answer. I mean, really, what is happening now? Just before what was that? The very last days of April, at last, a mission from ICOMOS and UNESCO visited just to check for these. And it is true that they were not informed by the Greek government about the works that were to be done. The Greek government says that the Ministry of Culture says that the works that were done on the Acropolis, these works, are of minor scale, and so they didn't have to ask to present
Minor scale?
Minor scale, they think they are. And so also the later things, I mean, the new proposals which will change the inside of the Acropolis plateau completely. I mean, can you imagine terraces covering the rock and reproducing in an imaginative way, let's say, the older terraces in the ancient sanctuary? All this would be new material, covering also the traces, the vestiges of the minor buildings between the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and the Propileos. So this is something which will, if it happened, I hope really that the UNESCO and the ICOMOS people will understand that. Because the ICOMOS Hellenic, the Greek part of the ICOMOS, is very, how to say, militant against these new works. And also the international ICOMOS is really has issued a paper saying we do not agree with that and we're very much concerned. ICOMOS is officially the consultant of UNESCO, but UNESCO, as you know, is a diplomatic, how to say, institution. It is intergovernmental, so it has to deal through the government. And governments, you know, are not always on the right side. I mean,
yes, but they cannot go back. That's the point. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for this unforgettable evening and your intervention.
Thank you for hosting me.
No, it's a
And
pleasure.
for your passions.
No, thank you so much. And see you next week with our next guest, Carmen Serrano de Aro. So thank you so much and see you on Monday. On Monday, on Wednesday.